Boise County, Idaho Territory, 1879. The scent of fresh bread traveled like a ghost on the wind, haunting every corner of the quiet mining town of Placerville. Orson Sutcliffe inhaled deeply as he dismounted his horse, tethering the weary animal to the hitching post outside the general store. He was a man of few words, hardened by life on his lonely ranch in the foothills and by the war that still visited him in dreams 13 years after it had ended. His weathered face, tanned from long days under the western sun, betrayed nothing of the empty ache that had settled in his chest since returning to Idaho Territory. "Mr. Sutcliffe," Thomas Miller called out from behind the counter as the bell above the door announced Orson's arrival. "Right on schedule, first Saturday of the month. Your usual supplies?" Orson nodded, removing his dust-covered Stetson. "And some coffee, if you have it. Just got a fresh shipment yesterday." "You're in luck," Thomas said, gathering items. "Say, have you met our newest resident? Widow from back east. Name's Beatrice Fairchild." Something in Thomas's tone made Orson glance up, only to find the shopkeeper's knowing smile. Orson had no interest in town gossip or matchmaking attempts. 6 years alone on his ranch had suited him just fine. "Can't say that I have," he replied curtly, effectively ending the conversation. As Thomas tallied the purchases, the door opened again, letting in a shaft of afternoon sunlight that momentarily blinded Orson. When his vision cleared, a woman stood in the doorway, clutching a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Her blue calico dress was simple but well kept, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, with a few wayward strands framing a face that spoke of both hardship and grace. "Mrs. Fairchild," Thomas greeted warmly. "Perfect timing. I was just mentioning you to Mr. Sutcliffe here." The woman, Beatrice, offered a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Miller, good afternoon. I've brought those loaves you ordered for the church social." Her voice carried the refined lilt of the East, but there was something underneath it, a resilience that Orson recognized in himself. Their eyes met briefly across the store, and something electric and unexpected passed between them before Orson looked away, suddenly finding great interest in the price of canned peaches. "Actually, Mrs. Fairchild," Thomas said, his tone suspiciously casual, "Mr. Sutcliffe here owns the big ranch about 5 miles west. Lives all alone out there. Might benefit from some of your famous bread, don't you think?" Orson shot Thomas a warning look, but the shopkeeper merely smiled innocently. "I wouldn't want to impose," Beatrice said softly, though her eyes showed curiosity when they landed on Orson again. "It's no imposition if he pays fair," Thomas added. "Best bread in 3 counties, Orson. The widow's been keeping half the town fed since she arrived in the spring." Something in Beatrice's expression shifted at the word widow, a flicker of pain quickly masked. Orson knew that look. He'd seen it in his own reflection often enough. "I'd be happy to purchase a loaf," Orson said, surprising himself with the words. Beatrice hesitated, then reached into her basket. "I have one extra, made with a touch of honey." She handed him a perfectly shaped loaf, still warm from the oven. "That'll be 15 cents, Mr. Sutcliffe." As he reached into his pocket for the coins, their fingers brushed during the exchange. Orson couldn't remember the last time he'd touched another person, even in passing. The simple contact sent an unexpected warmth through his calloused hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Fairchild," he managed, tucking the bread carefully among his purchases. "My pleasure." She glanced toward the window, where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. "You might want to hurry home. Looks like a storm's coming." Her concern seemed genuine, and Orson found himself nodding appreciatively. "Been watching those clouds all morning. Reckon I can beat them home." Little did he know that the approaching storm would be the least of his worries, and that the bread now nestled in his saddlebag would change the course of his solitary existence forever. That evening, as rain lashed against the windows of his ranch house, Orson sat at his rough-hewn table, staring at the loaf of bread he'd purchased. The cabin, built by his own hands after returning from the war, was sturdy but spare, a reflection of the man himself. No decorations adorned the walls, no photographs or mementos. Nothing to remind him of the family he'd lost to fever while he was fighting a war that seemed meaningless now. He sliced into the bread, the crust crackling beneath his knife. The aroma that rose from it was intoxicating, yeast and honey and something else he couldn't name. Something like home, though he scarcely remembered what that felt like. The first bite nearly undid him. It wasn't just bread. It was art, soft inside with a perfect crust, slightly sweet with a complexity that spoke of care and attention. Orson couldn't remember the last time he'd tasted something made with such evident love. As he ate in the flickering lamplight, listening to the storm rage outside, his thoughts kept returning to Beatrice Fairchild's face, to the strength and sorrow he'd glimpsed there. What had brought her west? What kind of man had her husband been? And why did the thought of her alone in town during this fierce storm trouble him so? The questions persisted as he prepared for bed, laying his weary body on the hard mattress that had never seemed quite so empty before. 3 weeks passed before Orson returned to town. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as he completed his errands, saving the general store for last. He told himself he wasn't disappointed when Beatrice wasn't there, even as he found himself lingering longer than necessary. "She bakes on Tuesdays and Fridays now," Thomas offered without prompting, his knowing smile returning. "Supplies running low from your last visit?" Orson cleared his throat. "Just the usual." "Shame about her situation," Thomas continued, wrapping parcels of sugar and coffee. "Husband died back in Pennsylvania. Consumption, I heard. Left her with nothing but debts. She came west on her sister's invitation, only to arrive and find her sister and brother-in-law had moved on to Oregon." He shook his head. "Woman's got grit, though. Turned her skill with baking into a way to support herself." Orson absorbed this information silently, wondering why it affected him so. Plenty of people had sad stories, himself included. "She's renting the old Peter's place," Thomas added, "just past the schoolhouse." Orson nodded curtly, paid for his supplies, and left without another word. He mounted his horse and turned toward home, but found himself taking the road past the schoolhouse instead. The Peters place was a small, whitewashed cottage with blue shutters and a front porch that leaned slightly to the left. A clothesline stretched across the side yard, white linens and a blue dress fluttering in the breeze. Smoke curled from the chimney despite the summer heat. Baking day, he realized. As if conjured by his thoughts, the front door opened, and Beatrice emerged, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. She stopped short when she saw him, recognition dawning on her face. "Mr. Sutcliffe," she called, shading her eyes against the sun. Orson touched the brim of his hat, suddenly aware of how dusty and unkempt he must appear. "Mrs. Fairchild." An awkward silence stretched between them until Beatrice gestured toward the house. "I've just taken some bread from the oven. Would you care for a loaf? Different recipe this time, sourdough with a bit of rosemary." "That would be." Orson searched for the right word. "Kind of you. Thank you." He dismounted, tethering his horse to her fence post. As he approached, he noticed more details about her: the small scar above her right eyebrow, the way the sun brought out auburn highlights in her hair, the capable strength in her flour-dusted hands. "Please, come in," she offered, holding the door. "It's cooler inside." Orson hesitated at the threshold. He hadn't been inside another person's home in years. The intimacy of it felt foreign, dangerous somehow. "I wouldn't want to impose," he said, echoing her words from their first meeting. "It's hardly an imposition to sell bread to a customer," she replied with a small smile. "Besides, I've just made a pot of coffee." The mention of coffee, real coffee, not the weak brew he made for himself, was the final persuasion he needed. He stepped inside, removing his hat as he ducked through the doorway. The cottage was modest but transformed by Beatrice's presence. Wildflowers brightened the table, hand-sewn curtains softened the windows, and the mingled scents of bread and coffee created an atmosphere of welcome that made Orson's chest tighten with a forgotten longing. "Please sit." Beatrice gestured to a chair at the small table. As she poured coffee into a delicate cup, one that had surely traveled west in her luggage, wrapped carefully against breaking, Orson noticed a photograph on the mantel. A serious-looking man in formal attire stood beside a younger Beatrice in a wedding dress. "My husband, James," she said, following his gaze. 3 years ago now. I'm sorry for your loss," Orson offered, the words feeling inadequate. "As am I for yours," she replied quietly. He looked at her sharply. "I don't recall mentioning any loss." Beatrice set his coffee before him. "You didn't have to. I recognized the look of someone who's carrying absence." She sat across from him. "Mr. Miller mentioned you fought in the war." "Union Army," Orson confirmed, staring into his coffee. Came back to find my wife and son taken by typhoid fever. The words fell between them like stones. He hadn't spoken of Sarah and little Thomas in so long that saying their names aloud felt like reopening a wound. Children are the hardest loss to bear, Beatrice said softly. James and I were never blessed with any, though we tried. Sometimes I think that's a mercy, considering. The simple honesty of her statement touched something in Orson. Here was a woman who understood grief without drowning in it, who had built a new life from the ashes of her old one. They sipped their coffee in a silence that gradually became comfortable. When Beatrice rose to fetch the bread, Orson found himself speaking again. That bread you sold me last month. It was the best I've ever tasted. A genuine smile bloomed on her face, transforming her features. High praise from a man of few words, Mr. Sutcliffe. Orson, he corrected. My name is Orson. Then you must call me Beatrice, she replied, placing a fragrant loaf before him. And I hope this one pleases you equally well. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. A recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or the first tentative bridge across the solitude that had defined them both for too long. As Orson reached for his money, Beatrice shook her head. Consider it payment for the company. It gets quiet here, especially in the evenings. The implication hung in the air, an admission of loneliness, maybe even an invitation for future visits. Orson, unaccustomed to such interactions, felt simultaneously drawn to and terrified by the possibility. I couldn't possibly, please, she insisted. It's a fair trade. Unable to argue further, he accepted the bread with a nod of thanks. As he prepared to leave, Beatrice followed him to the door. The church is having a social next Sunday after services, she said, her eyes fixed somewhere near his shoulder rather than meeting his gaze. I'm providing the bread, of course. It might be, that is, people would welcome seeing you there. The invitation caught him off guard. I haven't been much for church or social since coming back. Neither was I, at first, Beatrice admitted. But I found there's something to be said for remembering you're not alone in the world. She finally looked up at him. Just a thought, Orson. The way she said his name, softly, as if testing its sound on her tongue, did something peculiar to his insides. He settled his hat back on his head to hide his discomfort. I'll consider it, he said, knowing even as the words left his mouth that he would indeed be considering it far more than he should. As he mounted his horse and rode away, the warm bread secured in his saddlebag, Orson couldn't help glancing back. Beatrice stood on her porch watching him go, a solitary figure against the white clapboard house. Something about the image stayed with him all the way home. The contrast of her blue dress against the white walls, the dignity in her posture, the way she'd lifted a hand in farewell just before he turned the bend in the road. What he couldn't see was how Beatrice continued standing there long after he'd disappeared from view, wondering what madness had possessed her to invite the intimidating rancher to a church social, and why the prospect of seeing him again made her heart flutter in a way it hadn't in years. The following Sunday dawned clear and bright. Orson stood before the small mirror in his bedroom, struggling with his necktie. His Sunday best, rarely worn, felt stiff and unfamiliar against his skin. 3 times already he had changed his mind about attending the social, going so far as to remove the tie and unbutton his collar before changing his mind yet again. Damn fool, he muttered to his reflection, finally securing the tie in a passable knot. He told himself he was going because it was time to rejoin the community, to be something other than the hermit rancher folks whispered about. It had nothing to do with Beatrice Fairchild or her bread or the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she offered a genuine smile. The church was crowded when he arrived, his entrance causing a ripple of surprised glances and whispers. Orson kept his eyes forward as he slipped into a back pew just as the service began. Throughout the sermon, he found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the back of Beatrice's head, several rows ahead. She sat straight-backed and attentive, her hair arranged more elaborately than he'd seen before, with a small blue hat perched atop it. When the service ended and people began filing out to the church grounds where tables had been set up for the social, Orson hesitated. The prospect of small talk with townsfolk who viewed him as a curiosity was daunting. He considered slipping away unnoticed when a familiar voice stopped him. You came, Beatrice said, appearing beside him. Up close, he could see the care she'd taken with her appearance. The blue dress was one he hadn't seen before, with delicate embroidery at the collar that matched her eyes. Said I'd consider it, he replied, suddenly conscious of his rough hands and weathered face among the Sunday finery. I'm glad you did, she said simply. Come, I saved you some of the special bread I mentioned, olive and herb. It pairs well with Mrs. Peterson's preserves. Before he could protest, she had led him to the tables laden with food, deftly navigating the crowd and the curious stares. Her confidence in this social arena surprised him, the reserved widow showing a different facet of herself among her community. Mrs. Fairchild has been a godsend to our little church, Reverend Davis said, appearing at Orson's elbow. Her contributions to our bake sales have funded new hymnals and repairs to the roof. Is that so? Orson replied, watching as Beatrice chatted comfortably with an elderly woman across the lawn. Indeed, a remarkable woman, resilient despite her trials. The Reverend studied Orson thoughtfully. It's good to see you here, Mr. Sutcliffe. The Lord welcomes all his children home, no matter how long they've been away. Orson merely nodded, uncomfortable with the spiritual direction of the conversation. I understand you've been purchasing Mrs. Fairchild's bread, the Reverend continued, his tone deliberately casual. She mentioned you found it to your liking. The idea that Beatrice had spoken of him sent an unexpected warmth through Orson's chest. She's talented, he managed. Quite. The Reverend smiled knowingly. If you'll excuse me, I see Mrs. Davis signaling for my assistance. Left alone, Orson found a quiet spot beneath an oak tree where he could observe the gathering without being drawn into too many conversations. He watched Beatrice move among the townspeople, at ease in a way he couldn't fathom. She belonged here in a way he never had. Later, as the social began winding down, she approached him again, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. For you, she said, holding it out. Extra loaves from today? They'll only go stale if left. Their fingers brushed as he accepted the package, the brief contact sending that now familiar jolt through him. Thank you. What do I owe you? Beatrice hesitated, then squared her shoulders as if making a decision. Nothing for the bread. But perhaps you might show me your ranch sometime? I've heard it's quite beautiful, especially now with the wildflowers in bloom. The request caught him entirely off guard. His ranch was his sanctuary, his private domain untouched by visitors. Yet the thought of Beatrice there, standing in his kitchen or looking out over the meadows, wasn't as unwelcome as it should have been. It's nothing special, he said, deflecting. Just a simple place. I'd still like to see it, she persisted gently. If the invitation isn't too forward. The word forward hung between them, laden with implications. This wasn't merely a friendly request. It was a step towards something neither of them had named. It's a hard ride, he warned. And I've little to offer by way of hospitality. I'm stronger than I look, she countered, a hint of challenge in her voice. And I can bring provisions if needed. A small smile tugged at Orson's mouth despite himself. Sunday next, he heard himself say, I'll come fetch you around noon, if that suits. The brightness that illuminated her face at his acceptance made something long dormant unfurl in his chest. That would be perfect, she replied. As they parted ways, Orson couldn't help but notice the speculative glances from the townspeople, particularly Thomas Miller, whose satisfied expression suggested he took personal credit for this development. Let them talk, Orson thought. It was only a friendly visit, after all. But as he rode home clutching Beatrice's bread, the taste of companionship still fresh on his tongue, he knew he was deceiving himself. Whatever was growing between them was as unexpected as it was undeniable, and far more dangerous than he cared to admit. The week passed with agonizing slowness for Beatrice. Each day, as she kneaded dough and tended to her modest garden, her thoughts wandered to Orson Sutcliffe. She questioned her boldness in inviting herself to his ranch, wondering if she had overstepped boundaries or misread his reserved interest. James had been dead for 3 years now. The initial crushing grief had gradually given way to a dull ache of absence and, eventually, to a quiet acceptance. She had never expected to feel interest in another man, had, in fact, resigned herself to a life of practical independence. Yet something about Orson's steadfast solitude called to her own. By Sunday morning, Beatrice was a bundle of nerves. She changed her dress twice, finally settling on a practical riding skirt and jacket in deep green. Her hair she braided and pinned up securely, knowing the ride would be dusty. As noon approached, She prepared a basket with fresh bread, preserves, cheese, and apple tarts. A foolish gesture, perhaps. Orson hadn't asked her to bring food. But baking was her language, her way of communicating things she couldn't put into words. The knock at her door came precisely at noon. Orson stood on her porch looking uncomfortable but determined, leading 2 horses, his own sturdy bay and a gentle-looking Palomino mare. Mrs. Warner down the road loaned her mount, he explained, nodding toward the Palomino. Said she's the gentlest in the county, good for a lady rider. How thoughtful, Beatrice replied, touched by his consideration. I haven't ridden in some time, I admit. We can go slowly, he assured her, then noticed the basket. You didn't need to bring provisions. It's only polite when visiting someone's home for the first time, she said, handing him the basket to secure. Nothing elaborate. Their eyes met briefly, and Beatrice felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. At 32, she was too old for such schoolgirl reactions, yet she couldn't deny the effect this quiet man had on her. The ride to Orson's ranch took nearly an hour, during which they spoke little. Beatrice was too focused on remembering how to ride comfortably, and Orson seemed content with silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or naming wildflowers that dotted the trail. As they crested a final hill, Orson's ranch spread before them, a modest cabin nestled against a backdrop of pine trees, with corrals, a barn, and outbuildings arranged practically around it. A creek wound through the property, glinting in the midday sun. Beyond the immediate homestead, grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, dotted with cattle. It's beautiful, Beatrice breathed, genuinely impressed. You've done all this yourself? Bought it as raw land after the war, Orson replied, a hint of pride in his voice. Built what was needed, piece by piece. Started with a few head of cattle, now have close to 100. Quite an accomplishment, she said, understanding now why he seemed so connected to this place. It wasn't just a ranch. It was physical proof of his resilience, his ability to create something lasting after losing everything. They dismounted at the cabin, Orson helping her down with strong, steady hands that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary. He showed her to the porch, then took the horses to water them before returning. It's not much inside, he warned as he opened the door. Never saw much point in decorating for just myself. The cabin's interior was indeed sparse, but meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rocking chair placed before it. The kitchen area consisted of a wood stove, a dry sink, and a sturdy table with 2 chairs. A closed door presumably led to his bedroom. It's very efficient, Beatrice offered, noting the absence of any personal touches. No photographs, no mementos, nothing to suggest the man who lived here had a past or connections to others. The stark loneliness of it made her heart ache. Would you like coffee? Orson asked, clearly uncertain of his role as host. That would be lovely, she replied, setting her basket on the table. And perhaps we could share some of what I've brought? They fell into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm, Orson brewing coffee while Beatrice arranged bread, cheese, and preserves on the 2 plates she found in his cupboard. When they sat to eat, the domesticity of the scene struck her forcefully, as if they were playing at being husband and wife in this isolated cabin. The ranch keeps you busy, she observed, breaking the silence. Do you manage it all alone? Hire hands during calving season and roundup, he replied. Rest of the time, I prefer my own company. And yet you invited me here, she noted softly. Orson looked up from his plate, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected directness. You invited yourself, he reminded her, but there was no reproach in his tone. Though I find I don't mind the company. Yours, at least. The simple admission hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Beatrice felt a blush rise to her cheeks and focused intently on spreading preserves on her bread. After losing James, I thought I'd spend the rest of my days alone, she said, surprising herself with the confession. Coming west was meant to be a fresh start, but not this kind. What kind is that? Orson asked, his voice low. Beatrice gathered her courage and looked up at him. The kind where I find myself thinking about a man I barely know. Where I bake bread with extra care, hoping he might purchase it. Where I invite myself to his ranch because I want to understand him better. The boldness of her words seemed to startle them both. Orson set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Mrs. Fairchild, Beatrice, he corrected himself. I'm not a man given to fancy words or courtship. I've been alone so long I've forgotten how to be otherwise. Whatever you think you see in me is likely just wishful thinking. Is it? She challenged gently. Because I see a man who built a life from nothing after devastating loss. Who keeps his distance from others not out of dislike, but self-protection. Who treats my bread as if it were something precious. She paused. A man who arranged to borrow a gentle horse for a woman he barely knows, to make her comfortable on a long ride. Orson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You give me too much credit. I think perhaps you don't give yourself enough, she countered. The tension between them was palpable, not uncomfortable, but charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. Orson stood abruptly, breaking the moment. Let me show you the rest of the ranch, he suggested, while the weather holds. Grateful for the respite from emotional territory, Beatrice nodded and rose to join him. The afternoon passed pleasantly as Orson guided her around his property, showing her the spring-fed creek where he'd built a small dam to create a swimming hole, the barn where a new calf wobbled on spindly legs beside its mother, the vegetable garden that provided most of his produce. Throughout the tour, Beatrice noted how his demeanor changed when discussing his ranch. He spoke more freely, with quiet passion about his plans and the challenges he'd overcome. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they found themselves on a small rise overlooking the property. The golden light bathed everything in a warm glow, transforming the modest ranch into something magical. I can see why you love it here, Beatrice said, drawing her jacket closer against the cooling air. It feels peaceful. It does now, Orson replied, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Wasn't always so. First year, I nearly gave up a dozen times. Too much work, too many setbacks, too few reasons to keep going. He glanced at her. But stubbornness is a powerful thing. Indeed it is, she agreed with a small smile. It brought me west after James died, when everyone said a widow should stay where she was known and cared for. What made you leave? He asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Beatrice considered the question. Partly necessity. James left debts I couldn't pay on a seamstress's wages. Partly hope that my sister could help me start again. She sighed. Mostly, I think I needed to be somewhere he'd never been. Somewhere I could be Beatrice again, not just James Fairchild's grieving widow. Orson nodded in understanding. I left our home in Nebraska for similar reasons. Too many ghosts. And have you found peace here? She asked softly. Not peace, exactly, he admitted. But purpose. It's enough most days. The honesty of his answer touched her deeply. This was not a man who would offer pretty lies or false comfort. As the light faded further, Orson cleared his throat. We should head back before dark. The trail can be treacherous in poor light. The ride back to town was quieter than their outward journey, both lost in thoughts about the day and what it might signify. As they approached Beatrice's cottage, the lamps already lit within casting a welcoming glow, she felt a curious reluctance to end their time together. Orson helped her dismount, his strong hands at her waist sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. As he set her gently on the ground, she found herself standing very close to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Thank you for today, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For showing me your home. Thank you for the company, he replied, not stepping back. And the food. A moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken possibilities. Beatrice held her breath, wondering if he might kiss her, hoping he would, even as part of her feared it. Instead, Orson took a small step backward, breaking the spell. Good night, Beatrice, he said, his voice rough with something she couldn't quite name. Good night, Orson, she replied, trying to hide her disappointment. Will I see you in town soon? I expect so, he said, mounting his horse and gathering the Palomino's reins. Sleep well. As she watched him ride away, leading Mrs. Warner's horse, Beatrice pressed a hand to her chest where her heart beat a traitorous rhythm. What was she doing, developing feelings for a man as solitary and complex as Orson Sutcliffe? It could only lead to complications. Yet as she entered her cottage, she found herself planning which bread to bake next, perhaps the honey wheat he'd first purchased, or something new with the cinnamon she'd been saving for a special occasion. 2 weeks passed without word from Orson. Beatrice tried not to watch for him each time the bell above the general store door jingled, tried not to feel disappointed when it was never him. She told herself it was for the best. They were two wounded people who had briefly connected over shared loss, but had no business pursuing anything deeper. Then came the accident. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon as Beatrice was walking home from delivering bread to the hotel. The stagecoach came around the corner too fast, the driver distracted by something in the road. Beatrice heard shouts of warning, but was slow to react. The horses veered toward her, and in her panic to get away, she stepped backward off the boardwalk, twisting her ankles severely and falling hard onto the dusty street. Mrs. Fairchild, several people rushed to her aid, helping her up as the stagecoach driver profusely apologized. The pain in her ankle was immediate and intense. Dr. Morrison was summoned and pronounced it a bad sprain, not broken, but ordered her to stay off it completely for at least a week. How am I to manage? Beatrice fretted as they helped her home. The baking is my livelihood. The community will help, Reverend Davis assured her. It's what we do. True to his word, the ladies of the church organized a rotation of helpers and meal deliveries. For 3 days, Beatrice endured their well-meaning assistance while fretting about her lost income and the standing orders she couldn't fulfill. On the 4th day, a different knock sounded at her door, heavier, more hesitant. Come in, she called from the sofa where she'd been confined with her ankle elevated. The door opened slowly to reveal Orson, hat in hand, looking decidedly uncomfortable to be entering her home uninvited. Mrs. Fairchild, he greeted formally. I heard about your accident. Mr. Sutcliffe, she replied, equally formal though her heart leapt at the sight of him. News travels fast. Small towns, he said with a slight shrug. He stood awkwardly just inside the door, as if unsure of his welcome. I brought you something. From behind his back, he produced a loaf of bread, misshapen and slightly burned on one side. Beatrice stared at it in confusion. I tried to make it, Orson explained, his cheeks coloring slightly. Thought you might miss having fresh bread. It's not. Well, it's not like yours. The gesture, so unexpectedly thoughtful, so endearingly imperfect, brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. You baked bread for me? Attempted to, he corrected, finally moving further into the room. I'm better with cattle than kitchens, it seems. A laugh bubbled up through her tears. I'm touched, truly. No one's ever baked for me before. Orson set the misshapen loaf on the table beside her, then stood looking down at her with concern. How bad is it? He asked, nodding toward her bandaged ankle. Just a sprain, but Dr. Morrison is insistent I stay off it entirely for another few days. She sighed. I'm going mad with boredom, and worse, I've lost a week's income. Orson frowned thoughtfully. What if I helped? With the baking, I mean. Beatrice blinked in surprise. You? I'm a quick study, he said defensively, and I've got strong hands for kneading. You could direct me, and between us, we might manage your orders. The offer was so unexpected, so counter to everything she knew about this solitary man, that Beatrice was momentarily speechless. You would do that? For me? Seems only fair, he said gruffly. Your bread's been feeding me for months now. She studied him, trying to discern his true motivation. It would mean spending considerable time here. People would talk. Let them, he replied with unexpected firmness. Nothing improper about helping a neighbor in need. Something in the way he said neighbor made Beatrice wonder if he was deliberately creating distance between them after their day at the ranch. Still, the offer was practical and desperately needed. Very well, she agreed. Though I warn you, bread making is an art that requires patience. Good thing I've got plenty of that, Orson replied, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. When do we start? Thus began the most unusual week of Beatrice's life. Each morning, Orson would arrive at her cottage having already completed his essential ranch chores before dawn. Under her direction, he would measure flour, knead dough, and tend the oven while she supervised from her chair, her injured ankle propped on a stool. The first day was disastrous. Dough too sticky, oven too hot, timing all wrong. But Orson approached the task with the same methodical determination he applied to ranching, learning quickly from his mistakes. By the 3rd day, the loaves were presentable enough to sell, and by the 5th, they were almost as good as Beatrice's own. What surprised her most was how comfortable their unusual arrangement became. Orson was different within the walls of her home, less guarded, more willing to share small details of his life. She learned about his childhood in Ohio, his brief stint as a schoolteacher before the war, his hope to someday expand his cattle operation to include horses. In turn, she told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, her passion for creating new bread recipes, her dream of perhaps opening a proper bakery someday, instead of working from her home kitchen. On the seventh day, as they worked side by side, Beatrice finally allowed to stand for short periods. She realized with a jolt that she would miss this when it ended, miss his steady presence in her kitchen, the way he hummed tunelessly while kneading dough, the comfortable silences between them. "Penny for your thoughts," Orson said, catching her watching him shape a loaf. "I was just thinking that you've become quite proficient," she replied, not quite ready to share her true reflections. "A few more days, and you might put me out of business." He snorted softly. "Not likely. Though I admit there's something satisfying about it, creating something useful with your hands, watching it transform. That's precisely why I love it," Beatrice said, surprised by his insight. "Each loaf is both science and art, practical yet creative." Orson nodded, his hands never pausing in their work. "Like building a good fence or training a horse. Necessary, but with room for craftsmanship." They shared a smile of understanding that warmed Beatrice more than the oven's heat ever could. As the afternoon waned, Dr. Morrison arrived to check on her progress. He pronounced the ankle healing well and gave her permission to resume normal activities, provided she was careful not to overexert herself. "Good news," Orson said after the doctor left, though Beatrice thought she detected a note of something like regret in his voice. "Yes," she agreed quietly. "I suppose this means our baking partnership can end." Orson wiped his flour-covered hands on a towel, his expression unreadable. "I suppose it does." An awkward silence fell between them, their first in days. Beatrice searched for words to express her gratitude, to acknowledge what had grown between them during this week of unexpected intimacy. "Orson," she began hesitantly, "I don't know how to thank you properly for what you've done." "No need for thanks," he said gruffly. "Anyone would have helped." "But it wasn't anyone," she persisted. "It was you. And it meant more than I can say." His eyes met hers, dark and serious. "Beatrice," whatever he might have said was interrupted by a knock at the door. Thomas Miller entered without waiting for a response, carrying a package. "Mrs. Fairchild, I brought those baking supplies you ordered last." He stopped short at the sight of Orson standing in Beatrice's kitchen, covered in flour. "Well now, isn't this interesting?" The knowing tone made Beatrice bristle even as she felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Sutcliffe has been kind enough to assist with my baking while I recover. Thanks to him, I haven't lost all my customers." Thomas's eyes darted between them, clearly filing away this gossip for later distribution. Very neighborly of him indeed. Orson's expression had closed again, the openness of moments before replaced by his usual reserve. "Just lending a hand," he said flatly. "Mrs. Fairchild's ankle is much improved. Dr. Morrison just gave her clearance to resume her work." "Wonderful news," Thomas said, setting down his package. "Then I suppose your assistance won't be needed further?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. Beatrice looked to Orson, hoping he might contradict this assumption, might indicate some desire to continue their association beyond this practical arrangement. Instead, he merely nodded. "That's right. I should be getting back to the ranch, been neglecting things there." The disappointment that swept through Beatrice was disproportionate and revealing. She'd allowed herself to hope for something that clearly wasn't on offer. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice steady. "You've been more than generous with your time, Mr. Sutcliffe." The formality was deliberate, a step backward to safer ground, but she saw Orson register it with a slight narrowing of his eyes. "If you'll excuse me," Thomas said, clearly sensing the tension. "I have deliveries to complete. Good day to you both." After he departed, Orson and Beatrice stood in uncomfortable silence. The easy camaraderie of the past week seemed suddenly remote. "I'll finish this batch before I go," Orson finally said, turning back to the dough. "There's no need," Beatrice replied, more sharply than she intended. "As you heard, I'm quite recovered." His hands stilled on the dough. "Have I offended you somehow?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "No," she said after a moment. "I'm simply adjusting to the idea of managing on my own again." Orson studied her face as if trying to read a foreign language. "You were managing fine before your accident." "Better than fine." "Yes, well, Beatrice smoothed her apron, avoiding his gaze. Nevertheless, I've grown accustomed to having help this past week. I could still come by occasionally, he offered hesitantly. If you have large orders, or, that won't be necessary, she interrupted, pride making her voice cooler than she felt. You have your ranch to attend to, and I have my business. Our arrangement was temporary, as we both understood. Orson nodded slowly, wiping his hands clean one final time. As you wish. The formality between them felt wrong after the intimacy they'd shared, yet Beatrice couldn't bring herself to bridge the sudden chasm. A part of her, the part still raw from loss, was relieved at this natural conclusion to their association. Better to end things now before her heart became more involved. Thank you again for your assistance, she said, moving toward the door in clear dismissal. It won't be forgotten. Orson collected his hat, his expression once again the inscrutable mask she'd first encountered. Take care of that ankle, he said quietly. Good day, Mrs. Fairchild. As the door closed behind him, Beatrice sank into her chair, a curious emptiness spreading through her chest. The cottage that had felt so alive with his presence now seemed unnaturally still, the silence oppressive rather than peaceful. She told herself it was for the best, that two wounded people could offer each other nothing but further pain. Yet as she gazed at the loaves of bread they'd created together, she couldn't help but feel she'd just made a terrible mistake. Autumn arrived with brilliant colors and crisp mornings. 2 months had passed since Beatrice had last spoken to Orson. She'd seen him occasionally in town, their interactions limited to polite nods of acknowledgement before he hurried on his way. Each brief encounter left her with a renewed ache of regret and questions about what might have been. Her business had prospered despite her injured ankle, which had finally healed completely. Word of her bread had spread to neighboring communities, bringing new customers and even a few inquiries about opening a proper bakery in town. On a bright October morning, Beatrice was surprised by a knock at her door. Opening it, she found Reverend Davis standing on her porch, his expression grave. Mrs. Fairchild, he greeted her. May I come in? I'm afraid I have disturbing news. Her heart constricted with dread as she ushered him inside. What's happened? The Reverend removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. It's Mr. Sutcliffe. There's been an accident at his ranch. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Is he? She couldn't complete the question. He's alive, Reverend Davis assured her quickly, but injured rather badly. A bull gored him while he was repairing a fence. His ranch hand found him and brought him to Dr. Morrison. How serious? Beatrice asked, already reaching for her shawl. Serious enough. Lost a fair amount of blood, and there's concern about infection. The Reverend watched her closely. Dr. Morrison is doing what he can, but he mentioned that Mr. Sutcliffe has been asking for you in his feverish state. This information struck Beatrice like a physical blow. For me? Repeatedly, according to the doctor. The Reverend's expression softened. I know there's been talk about the nature of your friendship with Mr. Sutcliffe. I make no judgments, but if you could see your way clear to visiting him, it might ease his mind considerably. Of course I'll come, she said without hesitation. Where is he? At the doctor's office. They didn't dare move him further. Beatrice grabbed her shawl and a basket, into which she quickly placed a loaf of fresh bread, the honey wheat that had been their first connection. I'll go immediately. The doctor's office was a small building on the edge of town. Beatrice entered to find it quiet, with only Dr. Morrison's assistant visible in the front room. I've come to see Mr. Sutcliffe, she said without preamble. The young man nodded, unsurprised by her arrival. This way, Mrs. Fairchild. The doctor's just finished changing his bandages. He led her to a back room, where Orson lay on a narrow bed, his face pale against the white pillow, his torso heavily bandaged. Dr. Morrison stood nearby, washing his hands in a basin. Ah, Mrs. Fairchild, the doctor greeted her. I thought you might come. He's been asking for you, though he's not entirely lucid. Beatrice approached the bed cautiously, shocked by Orson's appearance. Always so strong and vital, he now looked diminished, his breathing labored, his skin sheened with sweat. How bad is it? She asked softly. The horn caught him in the side, missed vital organs, but tore muscle and caused significant blood loss. My primary concern now is infection. Dr. Morrison dried his hands. He's fighting a fever, which is to be expected. The next 24 hours will tell. May I sit with him? Beatrice asked, unable to take her eyes from Orson's face. Of course. In fact, I'd welcome it. My assistant needs rest, and someone should monitor his fever. The doctor paused. Will there be talk if you stay? Let there be, Beatrice replied firmly. I'll not leave him alone. Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly. I've left medicines and instructions on the table there. If his fever spikes dangerously, or if he begins to show signs of increased infection, send for me immediately. After the doctor departed, Beatrice pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, studying Orson's face. Even in unconsciousness, there was a tension to his features, as if he were battling internal demons along with physical injury. I'm here, Orson, she said softly, taking his hand in hers. It was hot with fever, but still strong. Those capable fingers that had kneaded bread dough now lying limp in her grasp. I'm right here. For hours, she maintained her vigil, bathing his forehead with cool cloths, administering medicine when required, speaking softly to him through his fevered mutterings. As night fell, Dr. Morrison returned briefly to check his patient, then provided Beatrice with a cot to rest on. You should sleep when you can, he advised. Tomorrow may be more difficult if the infection worsens. But Beatrice found sleep impossible. She dozed fitfully on the cot, alert to every sound from Orson. Shortly after midnight, his mutterings became more agitated, and she rose immediately to his side. Sarah, he called, his voice rough with fever. The baby, watch the baby. Beatrice's heart contracted painfully. He was calling for his dead wife, reliving his loss in his delirium. She bathed his forehead again, murmuring soothing nonsense. Don't go, he pleaded, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength. Don't leave me alone again. I'm not leaving, she promised, unsure if he could hear her. I'm staying right here, Orson. His eyes flickered open, unfocused and bright with fever. For a moment, he seemed to see her. Beatrice, he whispered. Yes, she said, hope surging through her. It's me. The bread, he mumbled. I need to finish the bread for you. Tears pricked at her eyes. Even in his delirium, he was still trying to help her. The bread can wait, she said, squeezing his hand. You need to rest and heal. His eyes drifted closed again, but his grip on her hand remained firm. Stay, he whispered. Please stay. I will, she promised. As long as you need me. Throughout the night, his fever ebbed and flowed. Beatrice maintained her vigil, praying as she hadn't since James fell ill, bargaining with God for Orson's life. By dawn, she was exhausted, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep, her back aching from hours in the uncomfortable chair. Dr. Morrison arrived early, his face grave as he examined his patient. The fever's still high, he observed, but the wound shows no further signs of infection. That's promising. Will he recover? Beatrice asked, her voice small. The doctor's expression softened at her obvious distress. He's strong, and he has something to live for, I think. He glanced meaningfully at their still-joined hands. Those factors often make the difference. The day passed in a blur of tending, waiting, and hoping. By evening, Orson's fever began to break, his skin cooling gradually under Beatrice's watchful care. His breathing became more regular, less labored, and his moments of consciousness more lucid. During one such moment, as dusk painted the small room in golden light, his eyes opened and focused clearly on her face. Beatrice, he whispered, his voice hoarse but present. What are you doing here? Taking care of you, she replied simply, relief washing through her at this evidence of his improving condition. You were injured. Memory flickered across his features. The bull, he murmured, caught me by surprise. You're lucky to be alive, she said, unable to keep a slight tremor from her voice. The Reverend said your ranch hand found you in time. Orson's brow furrowed. How long have I been here? Almost 2 days now. And you've been here all that time? He seemed genuinely puzzled by this. Beatrice nodded, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. You asked for me, she explained. In your fever. A flush that had nothing to do with his illness colored his cheeks. I don't remember that. You were quite insistent, she said, attempting a light tone. The doctor sent the Reverend to fetch me. Orson was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. I'm sorry to have troubled you, he finally said. It was no trouble, she replied softly. I wanted to come. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability she'd glimpsed only in rare moments. Why? He asked, the single word laden with meaning. Beatrice hesitated, knowing her answer would change everything between them. The past 2 days of fear and vigil had stripped away her pretenses, leaving only the truth she'd been avoiding. Because despite my best efforts to the contrary, I've come to care for you, she admitted. More than is perhaps wise. Orson's hand tightened around hers. I thought, after you sent me away that day, that you regretted our association. I was afraid, she confessed, of feeling something again, of being vulnerable to loss. I understand fear, he said quietly. It's kept me isolated for years. Safe, but incomplete. The honesty between them felt as fragile and precious as a newly formed loaf, ready for the oven's transforming heat. When the Reverend told me you were injured, Beatrice continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I realized that protecting myself from potential pain meant losing something valuable in the present. Orson's eyes, clear now despite his weakened state, held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. And what is that something, Beatrice? The chance to know you, she replied simply. To see if what's growing between us might flourish, given proper care and attention. A smile, rare and transformative, spread slowly across his face. Like bread dough, needing time and patience. Beatrice laughed softly, delighted by his metaphor. Precisely like that. Then perhaps, he said, his voice gaining strength, when I'm recovered enough to leave this bed, we might begin that process properly, without broken ankles or goring bulls to complicate matters. I'd like that very much, she replied, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Dr. Morrison entered then, pleased to find his patient alert and conversing. After examining Orson thoroughly, he pronounced him out of immediate danger, though full recovery would require weeks of rest. He can't stay here indefinitely, the doctor said to Beatrice. My office isn't equipped for long-term care. He'll need to be moved somewhere he can recuperate properly. My ranch, Orson began, but the doctor shook his head firmly. Out of the question. You need regular care and monitoring, not isolation miles from town. He can come to my cottage, Beatrice offered without hesitation, surprising both men. I have a spare bedroom, and I'm there most days for my baking. I could tend to him easily. The doctor raised an eyebrow. While I don't dispute the practical aspects of your suggestion, Mrs. Fairchild, there would certainly be talk. There's already talk, she replied firmly. Has been since Mr. Sutcliffe helped with my baking. One more piece of gossip won't signify. It might to your reputation, Orson said quietly. I won't have you compromised on my account. Beatrice met his concerned gaze steadily. My reputation is my own to risk, and I consider your well-being worth far more than idle gossip. The doctor looked between them, assessing. Well, if you're both in agreement, it's certainly the best medical option. Mr. Sutcliffe needs careful attention for at least 2 more weeks, possibly longer. Then it's settled, Beatrice said with a decisiveness that brooked no argument. We'll move him tomorrow, if you think him strong enough. Later, when the doctor had gone and twilight deepened in the small room, Orson reached for Beatrice's hand again. You're certain about this? He asked. Taking me into your home, enduring the speculation it will cause. I've never been more certain of anything, she replied, squeezing his fingers gently. Though I warn you, I expect you to resume your bread-making apprenticeship as soon as you're able. His low chuckle, though still weakened by illness, was the sweetest sound she'd heard in days. I believe I still owe you a properly baked loaf, he agreed. My last attempt was rather pathetic. It was perfect, she corrected him softly, because you made it for me. The look that passed between them then contained promises neither was quite ready to voice. Promises of companionship, of healing, of a future neither had dared imagine until now. The next 2 months transformed Beatrice's quiet cottage into a home filled with unexpected joy. Orson's recovery progressed steadily under her attentive care, and as his strength returned, so did their easy companionship from the baking days. True to prediction, the arrangement caused considerable gossip in Placerville. Some disapproved openly, while others, like Reverend Davis, chose to see it as a practical solution to a medical necessity. Beatrice found, to her surprise, that she cared far less about public opinion than she once had. By mid-December, Orson was well enough to return to his ranch, though he still rode into town almost daily, ostensibly to check on his business affairs but invariably ending up at Beatrice's cottage. Their courtship, for that was what it had become, though neither had formally acknowledged it, progressed with the same careful patience they applied to bread-making. They spoke often of their lost spouses, sharing memories without guilt or jealousy. Rather than creating distance, this honesty about their past loves deepened their connection, each understanding the space grief had carved in the other. On Christmas Eve, Orson arrived at Beatrice's door carrying a small fir tree and a mysterious package. Snow had fallen the night before, transforming the town into a winter wonderland and making his journey from the ranch more difficult than usual. "I wasn't sure you'd make it," Beatrice said, helping him brush snow from his coat. "The roads must be treacherous. Wild horses couldn't have kept me away," he replied, setting down the tree. "Though I admit my horse wasn't particularly enthusiastic about the journey." They spent the afternoon decorating the little tree with paper ornaments Beatrice had made and strings of cranberries and popcorn. As darkness fell, they sat before the fire, sharing the special bread Beatrice had baked for the occasion, a rich, sweet loaf studded with dried fruits and nuts. "I have something for you," Orson said when they had finished eating. He reached for the package he'd brought, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "It's not much, but—" Beatrice unwrapped the paper carefully to reveal a beautifully carved wooden box, its lid decorated with an intricate pattern of wheat sheaves. "Open it," he urged softly. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a delicate silver chain with a small pendant, a perfectly formed wheat stalk captured in silver. "Orson," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "It's beautiful. I had it made in Boise," he explained. "Rode there last month when I said I was checking on cattle." The thoughtfulness of the gift, so perfectly suited to her, brought tears to her eyes. "Help me put it on." His fingers were surprisingly deft as he fastened the clasp at the back of her neck, his touch lingering on her skin. When she turned to face him again, his expression was solemn, intent. "Beatrice," he began, taking her hands in his. "These past months have been. I never expected to find happiness again after Sarah and Thomas died. I'd resigned myself to solitude, convinced it was safer that way. I felt the same," she admitted softly, "after James. But then you baked bread for this lonely rancher," he continued, a smile touching his lips. "And somehow, that simple act of kindness opened a door I thought permanently closed." Beatrice's heart began to race as she recognized the direction of his words. "Orson, please, let me finish before my courage fails me," he requested gently. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures. I'm a simple rancher who's been given an unexpected second chance at life. First through surviving that bull, and now through your companionship." He took a deep breath, his hands tightening around hers. "What I'm trying to say, in my clumsy way, is that I love you, Beatrice Fairchild. I love your strength and your kindness, your talent and your resilience. I love that you see worth in a scarred, solitary man like me." Tears flowed freely down Beatrice's cheeks now, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I thought possible." Orson's face transformed with joy at her words. "Then would you consider becoming my wife? Sharing my ranch and my life, baking bread in a kitchen we build together?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, with all my heart." He drew her into his arms then, his kiss tender yet passionate, the culmination of months of growing affection and the promise of a lifetime together. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Orson pressed his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd have a family again," he murmured. "A home that was more than just shelter." "Nor I," Beatrice agreed. "It seems we've both been given a gift neither expected." Outside, snow began falling again, coating Placerville in a fresh blanket of white. But inside the cottage, warmth and hope prevailed as two once-broken hearts found in each other the perfect recipe for healing, and for a love that would sustain them through all the seasons to come. Placerville, Idaho Territory, 1885. The aroma of fresh bread filled the sprawling ranch house as Beatrice Sutcliffe removed the last batch of loaves from the large brick oven Orson had built for her as a first anniversary present. 6 years of marriage had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined when Orson first purchased a loaf of honey wheat bread from a widow new to town. "Something smells wonderful," Orson said, entering the kitchen after a morning tending the expanded herd. His face, once so solemn and closed, now regularly displayed the smile that still made Beatrice's heart skip. "Special recipe today," she replied, setting the bread on the cooling rack. "For our anniversary." He crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her expanding waistline, his hand resting protectively over the child that would join their family in just 3 more months. "Hard to believe it's been 6 years. The happiest of my life," Beatrice said, leaning into his embrace. Through the window, they could see the thriving ranch that they'd built together. The expanded house with its welcoming porch, the new barn painted red at Beatrice's insistence, the fenced garden where they grew vegetables and herbs, the orchards they'd planted their 2nd year together. Most meaningful to Beatrice was the small building near the main house, the bakery Orson had surprised her with on their 3rd anniversary. There, she created breads and pastries that were sold not only in Placerville, but in towns throughout Boise County, transported by the delivery service they'd established. "Remember how Thomas Miller tried to take credit for bringing us together?" Orson chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "He still does. Every time we deliver bread to his store," Beatrice laughed. "Though I maintain it was my superior baking skills that won your heart." "That and your compassion for a lonely, injured rancher," Orson agreed, his voice softening. "You brought me back to life, Beatrice." She turned in his arms to face him, her hand coming up to touch his cheek. "As you did for me." We healed each other. Outside, the sound of approaching horses announced visitors, likely the DeVises, who were joining them for their anniversary dinner. But for a moment longer, they remained in their embrace, grateful for the journey that had brought them together. From that first loaf of bread to the family and home they'd created, theirs was indeed a recipe for forever after, one that continued to nourish and sustain them through all of life's seasons.